Well, I'm working for still with the terrains team in Cambridge, and I'm working on specifically material culture and ceramics. And today we will try to look at what we learned from the past 4 years of research in Northwest India from excavations that the Terrains project conducted in Haryana. Yeah, I was mentioning most of my work is about ceramic materials or pottery, and I've been working first as a PhD under Cameron Petrie at Cambridge, and now as a research associate, finishing aspects of this research and developing publications as well. So here we are. Today we will discuss the topic of, in particular, ceramic forming techniques or forming method, which is how ancient potters, and in particular Indus civilization potters, produce their pottery, and why this is relevant or important for us archaeologists studying the Indus civilization. Now, what we know is that when developments such as introduction of wheels or rotational devices, we have certain developments in the ancient technologies and ancient traditions that, of course, has certain type of implications in terms of social implications, economic implications, and so on. And we will explore some of this. And in the past century, there's been a quite vibrant debate around the use of certain tools or techniques for producing pottery, in particular during the Bronze Age in South Asia, with clearly divided opinions of people thinking that ancient potters use, in fact, the wheels in certain ways or not. We will explore this aspect as well. In particular, we will look at evidence from two settlements, Loharirago and Masudpur, and evidence for the use of different gestures, techniques for producing vessels, and so on. And this will bring to the characterization of two dominant traditions of producers that we will, of course, explore during this talk as well. So first of all, before we get into the topic, I would like to make a short note on concept or terminology, which is sometimes a bit confused or confusing when we look at ancient pottery or ancient producers. Usually people use these terms that I put in the slide. Wheel throwing, or wheel finishing, or wheel fashioning, and rotational kinetic energy. Very often these terms are used interchangeably, or it's not clear what they refer to really. So for wheel throwing, I think we are all familiar with this concept, which is producing a container, an object, from the rough out, from the very beginning, from a mass of clay to the finished product. Not necessarily the very finished shape or product itself, but at least the finished shape or almost finished shape, which is using the wheel and the wheel throwing technique throughout the whole production sequence, let's say. And there's different types of tools that you can use, different type of wheels, slow wheel, fast wheel, but the determinant here is the fact that the wheel is employed throughout the whole sequence, from start to end of the forming of vessels. On the other hand, wheel fashioning or wheel finishing refers to the use of wheels or rotational gestures or rotational devices for specific moments of the production sequence. In particular, it could be at the end, and therefore named or called wheel finishing, when perhaps a potter could shape the rough out of a vessel using coiling or slabs, and then finish the product using a rotational device such as a turnet or turntable or a wheel, for instance, for scraping or smoothing the surface of vessels. However, rotational devices could also be employed at the beginning, and then the vessel could be finished using different techniques, for instance, pedal and anvil or many others. The determinant concept here is the rotational kinetic energy, or RKE. Is really a relatively new concept in the field of the study of ancient pottery or vessels, and it refers to the movement energy that an object has due to its spin or rotational velocity around its fixed central axis, which is basically the best way that a potter has to work around a vessel or an object without having to move around the object, really. So we can easily distinguish between vessels or containers that were produced using rotational gestures or RKE and vessels that do not use this type of energy or movement. How is this relevant for us? And how can we use this to investigate what was happening with Indus civilization producers? So first of all, I'd like to introduce a bit of the debate around the Potter's Wheel and the Indus civilization. Now, it's been ongoing for almost a century with ideas and suggestions of the use of certain type of wheels since the very first investigations in Pakistan, with suggestions of certain type of tools that were used, including a foot wheel for wheel throwing, for instance. However, it's important to know that we do not have secure archaeological evidence that demonstrate the use of certain tools. In particular, we don't have archaeological evidence for determine what type of wheels or tools were used by Indus civilization potters. At least they're not secured. Similarly, most of our observations are based on macroscopic assessments of traces, manufacturing traces of vessels, for instance, the presence of parallel striations. As we will see, this is not necessarily a strong evidence for the use of certain techniques, such as wheel throwing. It could be, for instance, evidence for wheel finishing or other techniques. This also comes with certain type of implications. By saying that the whole Indus civilization production of vessels were based on the use of rotational devices and wheel throwing techniques, we are kind of making it all a very homogeneous and very uniform landscape of practices and industries. And in fact, comes also with the implication of linear development of technologies, perhaps from even earlier, before the pre-urban period, perhaps from the Chalcolithic period down to the Indus civilization and beyond. And we really want to break down this idea of uniform landscape of practices and break down this idea of linear development. There was a trend that was initiated a few decades ago by looking at pottery production in neighboring regions, for instance, the Indo-Iranian region, with analysis of pottery from Shari Sokhtar and Kalibangan as well, with first and early suggestions about the use of multiple forming techniques, which was a nice way to move away from this uniform idea of wheel throwing for all producers and potters of the Indus civilization and the areas around it. Of course, these were initially strongly criticized because it really questioned something that was well accepted across the whole vast Indus zone. However, even though these were criticized for methods or sample size, they were still really useful studies to open certain questions on concepts that we believe were settled. Just another note here. I mentioned before that looking at certain type of forming techniques, certain type of traditions, and understanding variability of forming techniques and traditions comes with certain type of implications, mostly economic or social implications. What I mean by this is that by exploring variability, by exploring diversity of manufacturing techniques, we not only reconstruct different traditions, but we look at ancient societies. We look at how people structure their social spaces, but also how people related with each other. And we can also break down different communities, including the identities, perhaps, or identity statements that different communities of producers were making by accepting certain type of innovations or rejecting certain type of innovations because they didn't identify with this type of way of doing, way of making. And here's particularly interesting to look at case studies from areas that are west of the Indus civilization, in particular, the studies in the Aegean, but also the Levant and Near East, with studies on Bronze Age pottery production that demonstrated the presence of multiple traditions that use both rotational devices or not, which kind of tells us that you can have technological innovation in a region. You can have some potters and some communities of producers adopting, for instance, wheel throwing and the use of the wheel. And at the same time, in the same spaces, you can have potters that did not use rotational devices or the wheel throwing techniques. And this tells us a lot about variability of communities, but also this idea of social identities in the same regions that can be much more variable and diverse than we previously thought. And it gives us the opportunity to explore aspects such as kinship, gender, and subdivision of social structures. I mentioned before there are two main study that we will discuss today, two main archaeological sites that the Two Rains team excavated, Masudpur 1 and Loharirago 1. We excavated this in collaboration with Banaras Hindu University, and I'm personally extremely grateful to the team at PH2 of RN Singh, and it was, for both excavation was truly a very great experience. These two sites are very close to the large scale settlement of Rakhigarhi, which I think everyone is familiar with in northwest India. Both sites produce evidence for multiple occupational phases. Some of Loharirago in particular had phases dating from the pre-urban period of the Indus civilization, and Masudpur had more occupational phases during the urban period of the Indus civilization. But both sites offer us the opportunity to look at material from the period before cities or urban centers formed in the region and during the period of the formation of urban sites, and perhaps even beyond that, during the late urban phase and beyond. Now, I'm offering here some example of ceramic forming techniques to show you the variability of preliminary forming method or primary forming method. I mean, for instance, the use of coils or wheel coiling or slabs for forming vessels before rotational devices were used to smoothing or polishing vessels. So here you can see some of this evidence that I'm pointing to. For instance, the use of rotational gestures just for finishing the upper portion of vessels, such as rims. But you can also see different coils, use this on possibly attached rims on vessels, but also the presence of parallel striations in certain areas of vessels and scraping on lower portions of vessels. And these primary forming techniques very often are erased by secondary forming method. What happens is if a potter for finishing the vessel employ rotational gestures or rotational devices, more often than not would erase the evidence for primary forming methods such as coiling, wheel coiling, and so on. However, for some of these shards, we can still clearly see primary forming method, and this indicates that could be, in fact, the dominant way of producing pottery at the site. Now, this observation helped us to identify several technological groups, which are groups that share similar technological features, in particular ways of forming vessels. I'm going to concentrate on two only, which are the dominant technological groups that we identified at the sites. There is more, but we will not discuss them here. The first one does not show evidence for the use of rotational devices or rotational gestures at all. If any, it's just limited to the final stage of polishing of rims. But otherwise, the whole body suggests that most of the shards falling into this category just show preliminary forming methods or primary forming methods such as coiling or wheel coiling and then scraping for finishing vessels. There are certain degrees of polishing on the outer surface and other surface treatments for the external side of vessels. While a second technological group, so Group B, show a much more abundant use of rotational gestures and very likely rotational devices. These show a presence of parallel grooves throughout the whole body of vessels from base to the very top. And these mostly erase primary forming methods, but we can still observe them microscopically, but also using other methods that we will discuss in a moment. There is still a suggestion of use of multiple stages of production, for instance, the use of attached rims to certain vessels, but mostly we can identify this technological group through the evidence for abundant use of RKE or rotational gestures. I mentioned before that we can observe certain features macroscopically, but also through other methods. I didn't mention earlier that this study is part of a broader holistic study of ceramic materials. I'm concentrating here only on macroscopic assessments with just this reference to petrography. In fact, the broader holistic study look at macroscopic observations, but also petrographic data of ceramics, but also geochemical analysis of ceramics, FTIR, and it also includes an ethno-archaeological study with local communities of potters in the rural dimension in Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, as well as study of sources with collaborations with geoarchaeologists. However, for the purpose of this paper, I'm just going to concentrate on forming methods for these two main traditions. With just this reference to petrographic data that help us to observe primary forming methods that are erased on a macroscopic level, in particular the presence of relic coils in the fabric by observation of fabrics of these ceramic sherds. You can see here, one is maybe more visible, easier to pick than others. For instance, the photograph D. But overall, this method helped us to identify forming methods or confirm forming methods that are not immediately easy to observe. By looking at different aspects of ceramic productions of these technological groups, Group A and Group B, we could characterize and reconstruct the manufacturing sequence and sequence of actions for producing two main traditions or dominant tradition that we observe at the site. The first one is the what we call it Masopur-Lohari A tradition, and there is a Masopur-Lohari B tradition. We reconstructed more than two traditions, as I mentioned before, but we will concentrate on these two dominant ones and their social and economic implications. The first one, as I mentioned earlier, reflects the techno group A, with little to no use of rotational gesture whatsoever for producing vessels. This type of containers offer a good understanding of multiple forming methods, but as I also mentioned earlier, also typical finishing methods, for instance, surface treatments or surface decorations. In this case, some of these vessels show a very typical applied rustication with a ceramic paste characterized by the presence of limestone or calcrete or canker crushed in the paste or applied to the fresh paste or slurry when it was applied on the external surface of vessels. It's also characterized by some distinctive shapes, for instance, globular jar with this very typical outer rim that is usually seems to be applied in a secondary phase of final phase of forming methods, and is the only part of the vessel that sometimes shows rotational gestures, perhaps exactly for the reason of finishing and attaching the rim. There are some characteristic decorations, including painting and painted motifs on it, but what we observed is that painted motifs or styles of morphologies are not strong enough evidence for building these traditions and understanding changes, because they can change quite rapidly as opposed to the technological features of it. There seems to be much more stable over time and seems to be transmitted in a more consistent way, and perhaps comes also with certain cultural values attached, or also identity values. Some of the characteristic features of this, as I mentioned before, certain type of bases, for instance, ring bases, the use of calcrete or canker in the paste of a slurry applied to the surface of vessels, and as I mentioned, typically the use of coils combined with scraping for finishing this type of vessels, and certain type of decorations, including certain type of very characteristic incisions and painted motifs. The second group, which is also the second most dominant group identified at the site, we named it the Masopur-Lohari B tradition. It's definitely different from the first one for the use of rotational gestures and rotational devices. You can clearly see here mastering of some sort of wheel or turnet. Vessels are at least finished from the base to the rim with the use of rotational devices and rotational gestures used abundantly, which is also reflected in certain type of morphologies that are quite symmetrical. And and there's also other components that are attached to this tradition, which are certain type of, again, rustication applied to the surface of vessels, different type of recipes and paste recipes for the production of vessels, but also different type of recipes for these slurries that are not made by the use of calcrete or canker added to the paste, for instance, unique type of paintings and decoration as well, and morphologies that are unique to this type of traditions. I would say that this is possibly the most evocative of an Indus flavor. It may be not clear to say something like this, like what is actually an Indus flavor, but you can see certain type of similarities with pottery identified the settlements such as, well, Fermana, Mitatal, and Rakhigarhi and other Indus sites. So out of the two, perhaps people that are more familiar with Indus pottery would easily identify some of these shapes. Some of these are very classic shapes. Others demonstrate the presence of large storage jars produced in a similar fashion with similar recipes, with different methods during the production. For, of course, the size of vessels is quite different from small or medium-sized vessels, therefore require a bit of different methods for producing large storage jars, but they're there and they're quite distinctive of these traditions as well. So we identify these two traditions, the Indus Masupulohari A and B. What does it mean for us archaeologists, beside the fact that we reconstructed these, let's say, industries? Well, there's a number of implications that are quite important for us when we try to understand really ancient societies. In particular, the fact that these two traditions share some common features. Now, this can have two different types of interpretations. First one, it's likely these two were connected at some point in time, perhaps through a common ancestral origin of some type of pottery industry or tradition before the pre-urban period. Therefore, we're looking at some sort of parallel development of two traditions that split from a common origin. However, it's also possible that these traditions kept influencing each other over centuries during the pre-urban and urban period as well. Therefore, we can observe a sense of connection and amalgamation in terms of technologies, but also in terms of shared knowledge and symbolic knowledge as well, which of course, has some implication in terms of how these communities of producers related with each other, how they sustained and also reproduced their knowledge. And therefore, we can start observing a sense of shared identity values among these communities that we can expand on perhaps later on. But what is also clear is that these traditions are in fact different. So the producers occupied the same region, same spaces. They possibly, very likely, knew each other and knew the way of making were different, and knew that some of them mastered certain type of techniques and technologies that we may consider more advanced. However, they clearly decided to not adopt these traditions or these technologies or these techniques. Well, the reasons behind this can be multiple. But what is certain is that there's a clear effort to continue each individual tradition, to keep each individual tradition alive and sustain it through centuries, diversifying from others, therefore rejecting innovation or certain type of technological developments. This tells us a lot about the idea of polarization or segregation of certain type of communities, but also the idea of belonging of a certain community and community group within a certain region, in this case within, well, the landscape occupied at Masupur and Lohari and around these two sites. This type of study helped us to reconstruct these two traditions, but also understand how these traditions developed and changed through time. We're not going to go into this in detail, but these two traditions were not like a package of information that were transferred from the pre-urban period to the urban period and were not changed at all. Each of these traditions evolved and have transformations throughout centuries, but they still have maintained some essential features. As I mentioned before, these are mostly technological aspects that are much more durable and solid variables to observe changes and transformation of traditions more than looking just at styles or morphologies. By looking at this type of synchronic and diachronic changes and transformation, first of all, we could understand a bit more the dynamic of village production and household scale production. So what we know is that this tradition existed before the phenomenon of urban development and emergence of cities in the regions, for instance, Rakhigarhi nearby. However, this had little impact on the production of villages in the sense that, yes, there were transformations, but this tradition existed before the emergence of cities and continued throughout the urban phenomenon. This also helped us to, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, unpack the idea of linear development and uniform production throughout the Indus trajectory. This is something that we questioned in other papers. If you want to have a look, that go a bit more into the topic, but what what is really important for us is this idea of rejection of innovation and diversification of tradition that really help us to understand a bit more what was happening in the social space, but also in the material landscape in and around the site, with different experience of apprenticeship of potters within lineages and therefore within separate social units and perhaps communities of producers. At the same time, we also observe the phenomenon of amalgamation, or perhaps at least influences, social influences and technological influences among traditions, which is quite important to understand this network of producers that characterize the rural landscape. It would be, of course, interesting to see how this network interlocks with the urban landscapes. But this is something that we can do perhaps with future studies on technological traditions, looking at materials from urban sites. Finally, just a final remark on regional identity. This effort of potters to identify themselves is also attached to a sense of belonging to a certain type of tradition, which means, yes, they are aware of what's happening around them, but they really feel a sense of belonging to a certain type of way of doing, way of making, and perhaps a way of being. And this can help us to diversify the landscape of communities that characterize the Indus region in the rural dimension before, during, and after the emergence of cities.